Assalamu alaikum ji. Today we'll talk about another of the prominent followers of Freud. But before we touch upon his system and methodology of treatment, I want you to review, to recapture what we had done in the last lecture. We talked about a very prominent follower of Freud in lecture number 32, and his name was Carl Gustav Jung. In the last two lectures we had been talking about him. I brought to your attention his theory of personality, his theory of how personality may be divided into two parts, how extroverted or introverted personality expresses itself, वो शख्स जो अंदरूं भी है वो कैसे ज़िंदगी बसर करता है और वो शख्स जो बैरून भी है वो कैसे ज़िंदगी बसर करता है. Then we talked about functions of personality, कि शख्सियत में जो हमें कुदरत की तरफ से अता किया जाता है उसका इजहार कैसे होता है शख्सियत के ज़रिए से. In that context we talked about 4 functions of personality, that is sensation, thinking, intuition, and what was the 4th one? That's right, emoting. And then we talked about his concept of the unconscious. This was in particular reference to the last lecture, that is lecture 32. And in that context we had seen that he talks about the personal and the deeper layer of the unconscious that he calls the collective unconscious. We also talked about what is contained in these two layers of the unconscious. The personal unconscious, in his point of view, consists of what we repress, जो हम ख्वाहिश करते हैं लेकिन उस ख्वाहिश का इजहार नहीं कर पाते या नहीं कर सकते या नहीं करना चाहते. That goes into the personal unconscious. So the personal unconscious contains our repressed feelings, wishes, desires and needs. And then there is the other deeper layer of the unconscious that he called the collective unconscious. इस इज्तमाई लाशऊर में क्या है? नसख तमसाल, archetypes. Archetypes are experiences of the forefathers contained as certain tendencies to be, tendencies to express, tendencies to become. These are archetypes. And in that context we talked about at least 4 archetypes. We touched upon others, but we talked about in detail about 4 archetypes: the anima, the animus, the shadow, and the persona. And then I showed you his concept of psychotherapy and how psychotherapy was related to dream interpretation. Dream interpretation was, in Jung's point of view, to be understood, to be done in view of the personal and the collective unconscious. Jung के सिस्टम में ये बात अहम है कि उसने ये कहा कि मालिज के लिए या किसी दूसरे शख्स को समझने के लिए उसके ख्वाब को समझना, उसकी ताबीर करना अहम चीज़ है, लेकिन उसके साथ साथ उसने ये भी कहा कि इसकी अहमियत जब भी हम पे वाज़े होगी या मरीज़ पे वाज़े होगी जब हम ये देख पाएंगे मालिज की हैसियत से कि क्या वो ख्वाब जो है वो एक शख्स की ज़ाती लाशऊर की पैदावार है या उस शख्स के इज्तमाई लाशऊर की पैदावार है. Dreams therefore refer in the Jungian system to these two levels of consciousness. These two levels of consciousness are the personal and the collective. So in order for us to be able to understand and interpret dreams in Jungian point of view, we need to take a reference from whether the dreams come from the personal or the collective unconscious. As Freud had pointed out, dreams are an important ingredient, a vehicle, an important source, an important variable to be able to see, to be able to understand, to be able to observe the unconscious. In Jungian theory also, unconscious expresses itself through dreams. In order therefore for us to be able to understand the unconscious, लाशऊर को समझने के लिए ख्वाबों को समझना जरूरी है, और ख्वाबों को समझने के लिए ज़रूरी है कि हमें ये मालूम हो, एक मालिज को ये मालूम हो कि क्या वो ख्वाब जो है वो ज़ाती लाशऊर का इजहार है या इज्तमाई लाशऊर का इजहार है. और उसने ये भी कहा युंग ने कि क्योंकि हम ये चाह रहे हैं कि हमें पता चले कि ये ज़ाती लाशऊर की पैदावार और इजहार है या इज्तमाई लाशऊर की पैदावार या इजहार है, हमें ड्रीम्स के ख्वाबों के एक सिलसिले को समझना चाहिए. वाहिद ड्रीम ख्वाब जो है उसको सही तरह से समझा नहीं जा सकता जब तक कि उसका कॉन्टेक्स्ट न देखा जाए, और कॉन्टेक्स्ट जो है वो जब ही देखा जा सकता है जब एक ड्रीम्स की हम एक सिलसिले को देखें. अगर एक शख्स के 6 माह के दौरान जो ड्रीम्स हैं वो हमें एक सिलसिले की शक्ल में दिखाई देंगे, और वो मालिज के लिए एक मुनासिब रास्ता है उस शख्स के लाशऊर को समझने के लिए और ये जांचने के लिए कि क्या ख्वाब, ये जो ख्वाब हैं ये ज़ाती लाशऊर का इजहार है या इज्तमाई लाशऊर का इजहार है. तो एक इंटरप्रिटेशन, एक ख्वाबों की ताबीर युंग के ख्याल में ये भी है कि उनको सीरीज में समझा जाए, देखा जाए. हमने ये भी देखा था कि युंग के और नफ्सियाती इलाज के क्या तरीके हैं, और हमने ये देखा था कि उसने फ्री एसोसिएशन को रिजेक्ट किया था. उसने कहा फ्री एसोसिएशन हमें मिसलीड कर सकती है, और उसने डायलॉग को और डिस्कशन को और ख़ास तौर पे फुल कन्फेशन को अडॉप्ट किया ताकि वो मरीज़ों का, लोगों का इलाज कर सके. डायलॉग इज व्हेन वन पर्सन इज टॉकिंग टू द अदर पर्सन हार्ट टू हार्ट. जब दिल की बात बयान की जाए और दिल की बात सुनी जाए, दैट इज ए डायलॉग. और फुल कन्फेशन इज when a person lays bare his soul, जब वो अपनी रूह की गहराइयों की जो छुपी हुई चीज़ें हैं उनका भी इजहार और इकरार करता है किसी दूसरे के साथ, वो फुल कन्फेशन युंग उसको कहता है. और उसके ख्याल में डायलॉग और फुल कन्फेशन जो हैं ये इलाज के इम्पॉर्टेंट एलिमेंट्स हैं. युंग ने ये भी कहा था, आपको याद होगा कि उसने डिस्टिंग्विश किया बिटवीन क्योर एंड इंडिविजुएशन. You remember he talked about a cure maybe making a person symptom free. If somebody is suffering from anxiety and the malij, the psychotherapist, relieves his anxiety, that is cure. That is getting the person better than before. But Jung goes a step further than that. He says cure does not only mean ridding a person of his or her symptoms, it also means showing him a path to achieve the potential with which nature has endowed him. जो भी उसका पोटेंशियल है, जो भी कुदरत ने उसमें डाला है, साइंसदान बनने के लिए या बहुत अजीम फिलोसफर बनने के लिए या एथलीट बनने के लिए या म्यूजिशियन बनने के लिए या एक्टर बनने के लिए या बहुत अच्छा मुकर्रर बनने के लिए या बहुत बड़ा सियासतदान बनने के लिए या बहुत ही समझदार बाप और माँ बनने के लिए जो नेचर ने, कुदरत ने उसमें चीज़ें अनासिर डाली हैं, अगर वो शख्स उनको रियलाइज करके उनको उनका इजहार कर पाता है तो वो क्योर का हिस्सा हैं. And that should be the aim of psychotherapy. Not only to treat and dissolve symptoms, which of course is treatment, but also help the individual to develop, to realize his or her potential. To be able to realize one's potential is what Jung calls the process of individuation. Individuation is reaching the top of the potential that God has given to you. That is what individuation is. And that is what Jung's system of analytical psychology is. Let us go forward of Jung and take a look at another one of a distinguished dissenters of Freud's. Dissenter is somebody who disagrees, who finds another way away from the established path. Alfred Adler, born 1870, died 1937, is considered an important, a prominent, distinguished dissenter who originally was part of the inner circle of Freud and his followers. He was a psychoanalyst by training. He trained with Freud, under Freud's other disciples, and became an expert in treatment of mental disorders in the system of psychoanalysis. But Adler disagreed with Freud on a number of topics, on a number of points, and therefore later, a few years later, changed his allegiance, changed his belongingness to the inner circle or inner point of view of psychoanalysis and put forward his own system and his own methodology of treatment of mental disorders. One of the things that he disagreed with Freud upon was that Adler thought that Freud put too much stress on sex as a determinant of human behavior. He thought that Freud ignored other important factors that determine human behavior, that are the causes, the dynamics of human behavior, including mental disease. And that is why he separated. Freud was very angry with Adler and his followers. In one of his letters to his friends, Freud calls him Adler and the Adlerian buffoons. इतना नाराज था वो फ्रॉयड अपने पुराने दोस्त आडलर के साथ. बफून्स मतलब बेवकूफ. He called this group Adler and the Adlerian buffoons. In one of his, of course, it's not a public knowledge. It wasn't a public knowledge at that time because he had written a letter. Those letters had been published after Freud's death, and they are part of the record of psychoanalytical movement. उसमें युंग के बारे में भी काफ़ी बातें हैं. उसमें अगर आपको याद होगा उस कलेक्शन ऑफ लेटर्स में मैंने आपको बताया था, एना ओ के बारे में जिक्र किया था, जो एक लड़की थी जो फ्रॉइड के उस्ताद ब्रायर ने और फिर फ्रॉइड ने ट्रीट किया था उसको, उसके बारे में भी काफ़ी जिक्र अज़कार हैं। फ्रॉइड ने अपनी बेटी के बारे में, एना फ्रॉइड, जिसका हमने ईगो साइकोएनालिस्ट के रेफरेंस में जिक्र किया था, उसके बारे में भी बहुत एलेबरेट बातें लिखी हुई हैं अपने दोस्तों को अपने ख़तों में। ये तमाम इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ें फ्रॉइड के खतूत में मौजूद हैं। मेरी ख्वाहिश तो ये होगी कि आप वो खतूत ज़रूर पढ़ें, ज़रूर पढ़िए, बहुत लुत्फ़ आएगा आपको। एनीवे, फ्रॉइड कॉल्ड Adler and his followers buffoons, people who were less intelligent, and that shows his negativity for these people. Adler, why would Freud be so staunchly against Adler? Because one thing that Adler puts forward in his system is his concept of inferiority. Adler put forward the view that a person's psychology is actually his feeling of organic inferiority. That there is no influence of sex or collective unconscious on him, as Freud and Jung had said, but his personality is determined by his organic inferiority. ये organic inferiority आडलर के system of individual psychology में क्या है? His system of individual psychology defines organic inferiority as one of the major determinants of human behavior, and this organic inferiority is that somebody feels that he has a physical defect. Now, we know that human beings are less than perfect, that all and everyone has certain infirmities, certain inferiorities, certain defects. Therefore, to feel that someone, that A, B or C has an inferiority is just a natural thing, and that is what Adler is pointing out, that human psychology is based upon a feeling of inferiority which is organic in nature. अब अगर मैं ये सोचूं कि मेरे कान बड़े हैं, अब अगर कोई ये शख्स सोचे कि उसका कद छोटा है, अब अगर कोई ये शख्स देखे, कोई खातून ये सोचे कि उसकी एक आंख और दूसरी आंख बड़ी छोटी है, अगर कोई ये शख्स देखे या ये समझे कि उसके बाल कम हैं, तो ये तमाम चीज़ें जो हैं ये आडलर के ख्याल में आर द बेसिस ऑफ inferiority, what he calls organic inferiority. Organic inferiority, this feeling is an important dynamic determinant of human behavior. Because of this feeling of inferiority, one develops, Adler believed, a striving for superiority. क्योंकि एक शख्स अपने आप को किसी लिहाज से, किसी तरह से कमतर महसूस करता है, इसलिए उस कमी को कॉम्पनसेट करने के लिए, उस कमी का अजाला करने के लिए वो शख्स अपने आप को बड़ा साबित करना चाहता है, बड़ा दिखाना चाहता है। एक बात इस रेफरेंस में मैं आपकी मेमोरी पे थोड़ा सा बार डालूंगा और कहूंगा कि थोड़ा पीछे चलते हैं और चलते हैं गेस्टाल्ट स्कूल में। You remember one of the concepts that the Gestalt school people had floated was the concept of geographical field and perceptual field. Let me refresh your memory. Geographical field is what actually physically exists, and perceptual field is what I think exists. You remember that? I gave you the example of you walking in a lawn during dawn or dusk, and then observing a twig, and then confusing that twig to be a snake. The geographical field here is a piece of wood, but you are reacting to that piece of wood as if it was a snake, and in your perceptual field, that twig is a snake. Your reaction is not to the geographical field, your reaction is to the perceptual field. Let us come back to Adler now, keeping that in mind. If somebody thinks that he has an inferiority, that he is too short, too fat, nose is too long, teeth are too obtruse, hanging in front, if he thinks that, whether that is right or wrong doesn't matter to him, because to him what matters is his perception. He is reacting to the perceptual field, so his feeling of inferiority is real. Even when it is not based upon reality, it is real for him, because as Gestalt people had pointed out, we react to the perceptual field. To us, the field of perception is the real one, not the field, the geographical, actual material field. So if somebody is 6 feet, 5 feet and 7 inches, but feels that he is short, but feels that he is not as tall as could have been, that might be a source of inferiority. His perception creates that inferiority. And you can see the parallel between Adlerian point of view and the Gestalt point of view. You can see that they were right, and he takes the lead from there and says, we react to our inferiority. Whether the inferiority is actual, physical, or imagined. So long as we feel that a person, we are inferior, that is our motive, that is something that propels us. Now, of course, परफेक्ट तो एक सिर्फ अल्लाह ताला की ज़ात बारी ताला ही है, इसलिए हम में हर शख्स में कोई ना कोई कोताही कमी मौजूद है. इसलिए आडलेरियन थियोरी के, आडलेरियन सिस्टम के मुताबिक every person has a feeling of inferiority which propels him to develop superiority. And how can one develop superiority? By adopting two things, Adler says. And what are those two things? Compensation and overcompensation. Striving for superiority leads to compensation and overcompensation. Compensation is that if someone feels that he is short in stature, he begins to wear shoes with specially made high heels. If somebody feels that his eyes are not of equal size, एक उसके ख्याल में उसकी एक आंख बड़ी है और एक छोटी है, so he begins to wear dark glasses to hide that. These are examples of compensation. अगर कोई शख्स समझता है कि उसके तकरीर में हकलाहट है, वो हकलाता है और उस इंफीरियरिटी को दूर करने के लिए वो बहुत बड़ा एक्टर बन जाता है, तो दैट वुड बी एन एग्जाम्पल ऑफ ओवर कॉम्पनसेशन. He is not only compensating, he is not learning to talk flawlessly, he is becoming an orator. And that is an example of overcompensation. If somebody felt in his past life that he was weak physically, and then he goes into bodybuilding and becomes the national or European or Asian or even world-class bodybuilder, that would be an example of compensation leading to overcompensation. अपनी perceived कमजोरी को उस शख्स ने बहुत ही बड़ी मजबूती बना लिया. That is Adler's point of view about compensation and overcompensation. He points out the role of imagination in overcompensation and compensation. He puts forward the view, Adler puts forward the view that imagination plays a very important role in getting somebody to compensate and overcompensate. Daydreaming is an example of compensation or overcompensation. Flights of fantasy are examples of compensation and overcompensation. Imagination is a way how a person may overcompensate. He might do that in his imagination, or he might imagine himself in a big, superior position and role, and later may put his back to it and actually achieve that highly exalted position. And that is the role of imagination in compensation. Adler talks about this organic inferiority leading to the creation of feelings of inferiority. He talks about a feeling of inferiority that one may want to compensate, that leads one to superiority, the striving for superiority, his tendency to excel, his tendency never to give up until that felt inferiority has been compensated or has been gotten rid of. He also talks about inferiority complex. He distinguishes between feelings of inferiority and inferiority complex. Feelings of inferiority are at the conscious level. A person who feels that he is inferior in some respect or the other, he is conscious of the fact, and he is compensating for that fact, compensating for that feeling of inferiority. But when that feeling of inferiority is not recognized, is not acknowledged at the conscious level, then that feeling of inferiority, in Adlerian point of view, is turned into, becomes what he calls inferiority complex. Inferiority complex, in Adlerian point of view, is an unconscious motivator. Inferiority feeling is a conscious motivator. That's the vital difference in Adlerian individual psychology, in his system of psychology that Adler and his followers developed. Inferiority has a central place, theme. On the one hand, there is inferiority feeling resulting into acceptance and then compensation, then superiority. But inferiority feeling not recognized, but felt, but not accepted, turned into what he calls inferiority complex. Inferiority complex is an unconscious motivator. So in a way, Adler is also talking about an unconscious and how the unconscious motivates. Beyond the feelings of inferiority and beyond the inferiority complex, because of the feelings, above and beyond them, one develops a tendency to be aggressive. इसका क्या ताल्लुक है? इसका भी थोड़ा लॉजिक देखें. If a person is feeling inferior, if a person doesn't acknowledge that, then the person tends to become ridden by inferiority complex. The complex then motivates him. If the complex of inferiority is motivating somebody, what would be the natural reaction of that somebody? To become aggressive. He is feeling weak. He is feeling inadequate. He is feeling withdrawn. What is he going to do? One of the ways, or the predominant way of reacting to that feeling of inferiority or inferiority complex, is to become aggressive. So, in Adlerian system, the central theme is that of inferiority feeling and complex, leading to a striving for superiority, becoming a drive for aggression. उसके सिस्टम में हमारी जिंदगियों में जो गमो गुस्सा है वो हमारे बनी नौ इंसान की एहसासे कमतरी की वजह से है. ये एहसास कमतरी उसको गुस्से और तसादुम की तरफ माइल करता है, क्योंकि एहसास कमतरी को कॉम्पनसेट करने का, को ख़त्म करने का एक ही तरीका है, और वो है टू डोमिनेट, टू ओवरपावर. To dominate and overpower means to become aggressive. Striving for aggression, or what he calls a desire for aggression, what he calls a push to be aggressive, is therefore another motivator in the psychology of people in Adlerian system of इंडिविजुअल साइकोलॉजी. लेकिन क्या इंसानों में सिर्फ इंफीरियरिटी और उसकी कॉम्पनसेशन सुपीरियरिटी, और क्या अग्रेशन और गुस्सा ही है, या कुछ और भी है? आडलर के ख्याल में इंसानों में एक और अहम वेरिएबल है, और वो है व्हाट ही कॉल्स सोशल इंटरेस्ट. All of us, in one way or the other, in spite of our inferiorities, all of us, in spite of all our shortcomings, all of us, in spite of our desire to be aggressive and domineering and overpowering, we still have a need for affiliation, a need to socialize, a need to be with friends, a need to share, a need to be heard, a need to hear. And that is what he calls social interest. And that is another landmark in the theory of Adlerian individual psychology. We have inferiority feelings, we have striving for superiority, we have drive for aggression, we also have social interest. Based upon these elements, everyone develops a peculiar style of life. A style of life of a person expresses his particular inferiority, his compensation, overcompensation, and striving for superiority, his drive for aggression. These things merge together, mesh together, and prepare and appear in the form of a style of life of a person. In Adlerian system of individual psychology, style of life is an expression of one's feelings of inferiority, one's drive for superiority, striving for superiority, one's drive for aggression, and these three elements coming together make a person, and that person These three elements are expressed in his way of being, and that way of being is his style of life. Style of life shows on one hand the negativity, inferiority, superiority, aggression, and positivity, social interest. These two elements, the inferior and the social interest, when they mesh, when they come together, they create what Adler and the Adlerians call a style of life. And a human being and a person expresses his style of life in everything, including his mental disorder. उसका बैठना, चलना, खाना, पीना, कपड़े पहनना, सोने का अंदाज, शादी करना या ना करना, पढ़ना, लिखना, प्रोफेशन अडॉप्ट करना, कौन सा प्रोफेशन अडॉप्ट करना, कौन सा ना करना, किस शख्स से शादी करना, किसके साथ शादी ना करना, शादी करना या शादी ना करना, being a married or a bachelor, अपने प्रोफेशन का इंतखाब, क्या उसने साइंसदान बनना है या म्यूजिशियन बनना है या स्पोर्ट्स पर्सन बनना है, all of these in Adlerian point of view express a person's style of life. We can understand the mechanisms of the negativity, inferiority, superiority striving and aggression, and the positivity, that is social interest, in a person's style of life. We can also understand his mental disease in view of his style of life. Mental disease is an expression of the style of life of a person in Adlerian individual psychology. उसने सवाल पूछा आडलर ने अपने आप से कि ये क्या वजह है कि एक शख्स हिस्टेरिक है और एक शख्स एंजाइटी न्यूरोटिक है, एक शख्स को ऑब्सेशंस हैं और एक शख्स को कंपल्शंस हैं. क्या वजह है कि मुख्तलिफ किस्म की ज़हनी अमराज मुख्तलिफ अशखास को दरपेश हैं. उसकी एक्सप्लेनेशन आडलर ऐसे दे रहा है कि वो ज़हनी अमराज उस शख्स के स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ को एक्सप्रेस कर रही हैं. हमारा स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ जो है आडलेरियन पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू के मुताबिक वो हमारी जिंदगी की अक्कासी नहीं कर रहा महज, बल्कि एक शख्स के ज़हनी अलामात की अक्कासी भी कर रहा है जो उसको ज़हनी आर्जा लाहक है, उसका इजहार उसके स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ में हो रहा है इन आडलेरियन पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू. इसलिए स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ को समझना, उसका तज्जिया करना ही एक इलाज का जरिया है इन आडलर्स सिस्टम ऑफ साइकोथेरेपी इन इंडिविजुअल साइकोलॉजी. थोड़ा इसका और डिटेल से भी जायजा ले लेते हैं कि इसकी टेक्नोलॉजी क्या है. स्टाइल ऑफ लाइफ का तज्जिया करने की टेक्नोलॉजी क्या है, कैसे करना चाहिए. नंबर 1, पहली चीज जो आडलर स्ट्रेस करता है इस रेफरेंस में वो है डेवलपिंग ए गुड डिपेंडिंग रिलेशनशिप बिटवीन द पेशेंट एंड द डॉक्टर. जो मरीज और मालिज का जो बाहम रिश्ता है उसमें मरीज के लिए मालिज पर भरोसा करना और उसको अपना हमदर्द समझना आडलर के नज़दीक एक अहम टेक्नोलॉजी है. फ्रॉइड and others had called this relationship rapport. R-A-P-P-O-R-T, written as rapport, pronounced as rapport. And that is what Adler is stressing, developing a good relationship between the doctor and the patient. That's one important technology of treatment of mental disorders in Adlerian's system of theory within individual psychology. The other is direct conversation. If you remember, Freud had asked his patient to lie down on a couch and he would sit behind so that the patient would not be able to see him. But Adler, like Jung, adopts a direct face-to-face conversation between the patient and the doctor. Adler also adopted interpretation of dreams as an important technology of treatment of mental disorders. But interpretation of dreams not to see what is in the unconscious or not to analyze what Jung had said to see in the collective unconscious of the patient, but use dream interpretation to see the inferiority, the striving for superiority, the drive for aggression, and the social interest in the patient. Dream interpretation in Adlerian point of view is analysis of style of life in terms of what are the motivating factors in terms of inferiority of a person. How inferiority in a person's scheme of things is being compensated or turned into striving for superiority. How superiority has turned into a desire for dominating, a desire to overpower, in other words, a drive for aggression. And how these negative variables mesh with the positive one, that is his social interest. These are the elements that Adler thought express themselves in dreams. And if the therapist could understand, interpret dreams, seeing the expression of these elements, these variables, then the therapist can help the patient to understand his inferiority, his driving force, his striving for superiority, his will to power, and his social interest. Dream interpretation is another technology apart from direct conversation and apart from developing a good human relationship between a patient and a doctor. Another technology that Adler talks about as a tool in therapy in individual psychology is analysis of childhood memories, because Adler believed that childhood memories determine, influence the inferiorities that a person feels. क्योंकि एक शख्स किसी ज़माने में कमज़ोर, नहीफ और डिपेंडेंट था as a child, as an infant, therefore he has those memories of his which make him feel inferior and dependent. वो अपने आप को बच्चे की हैसियत में मोहताज पाता था, वो अपने आप को एक बच्चे की हैसियत में दूसरे लोगों से कमतर पाता था, इसलिए उसमें इंफीरियरिटी का अंसर उसकी ज़ात में, उसकी शख्सियत में शामिल हो गया. और अगर आडलर के ख्याल में बचपन की यादाश्त में, चाइल्डहुड मेमोरीज में इन चीज़ों को तलाश कर लिया जाए, तो फिर these things can be brought to the attention and consciousness of the patient, and then the patient can understand his dynamics of inferiority. ایک شخص یہ سمجھنے کے قابل ہو جائے گا کہ وہ کمتر محسوس اس لیے کر رہا ہے آج کیونکہ بچپن میں اس نے محتاجی کا ایک دور گزارا ہے اور اب تک وہ اسی محتاجی کے دور کے ساتھ منسلک اور اپنے آپ کو چمٹا ہوا پاتا ہے. اس چیز کا اظہار if all of these elements of childhood memories are brought to the consciousness of a patient, the patient would understand the dynamics of inferiority and would recover. This is another technology that Adler uses. Another technology that Adler used in his therapy, in his system of therapy, in individual psychology, was to discover the heroes that a person has, the heroes that he likes and the villains that he dislikes. Why would anybody do that? Because Adler believed that heroes represent the imagination of the patient and they represent how those heroes compensated for the inferiority that the heroes felt. So, if the patient likes a hero, that shows that the patient would like to adopt the same mechanism that his hero adopted to overcome what hero felt inferior, so the patient would feel the same way and compensate for his inferiority in the same manner. Identification of the heroes of the person is an important tool that Adler uses to identify the problems the patient has, and those identifications and those heroes can help the therapist to understand how the mind of the patient works, and then the therapist can help the patient. And last but not the least technology in this context is the body language of the patient, how he sits, how he talks, whether or not he is stooped or he walks like that. Body posture, body language was an important tool for the understanding of a patient's style of life, and Adler used it to great advantage to analyze his patients. Let me also point out the fact that body language is a very recent science in psychology. And this is Adler in the early years or middle years of the 20th century using bodily cues to understand patients and their dilemma and their diseases. Adler really anticipated the role of body language on non-verbal language in this context. And that is one of the prominent elements in his system. And these are some of the technologies that he uses for therapy. Before we end up today, let us see what we talked about in Adlerian system. We talked about two things, Adler's theory and practice. His theory consists of the feelings of inferiority coming into an inferiority complex or inferiority feelings giving rise to feelings of superiority, a striving for superiority leading to compensation or overcompensation, and compensation or overcompensation taking the form of will to dominate, will to power, to be aggressive. And then these 2 or 3 or 4 elements on one hand, and then this desire for a person to affiliate, to be social, to socialize, which he calls social interest. Because of these two poles, a style of life develops in a person. A style of life expresses itself in all things in his life, including his neurosis. And neurosis can be dissolved, in Adlerian's point of view, by various technologies, understanding style of life, direct conversation, dialogue, looking at the body language, looking at the heroes of the person, and looking into the childhood memories. All of these things help the person who is treating a patient to understand and to show the patient the way to recovery. That is how one of the prominent followers of Freud broke away with him and developed his own system. That is what Alfred Adler is, and his system is called individual psychology. I hope you have some understanding of it and that you'll be able to read it and understand it. Until next time, look after yourselves. Khuda Hafiz. God be with you.